Hi, in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ethernet frame. Okay, so first of all, there are lots of different types of Ethernet frames and the different fields that you may see in them. There's a long and sordid history about all this, and it goes way back even to the days of Novell networks and stuff. But what we're going to be focusing on is primarily this frame right here, the Ethernet 2 version. You also might see the IEEE 802.3 frame if you're doing wire short captures. But we're going to focus mostly on the Ethernet 2. And by the way, your Ethernet NIC cards and Ethernet switches, they recognize all these different frames, and they're basically all have the same basic fields, and it's no longer necessary to go into the sordid history and the various types of these. Okay, so a little bit about the Ethernet frame itself. So we've talked about what's in some of these different fields in a previous video. But the main part of the Ethernet frame, as we can see here, are these fields here. We have the destination MAC address. That's the NIC card address of who this Ethernet frame is destined for. We have the Ethernet MAC source address here. That's the MAC address of the NIC card that sent the frame. I'm going to skip the 802.1 tag for a moment. We have the type field. This says, what kind of data am I carrying as far as the payload, as far as the data? Is this IPv6? Is this IPv4? Is it a ARP message? Whatever. Okay, and we've also have the frame check sequence over here in the trailer. Okay, and we've talked about those previously. We also have this optional 802.1q tag. We're not going to worry about that right now. That has to do with VLANs, virtual local area networks, and it is used by Ethernet switches to do something we call VLAN trunks, but we won't worry about that right now. The minimum Ethernet frame size is 64 bits. So there's actually a minimum of 42 bytes that must be in the data. I won't go into the history of this, but this all has to do with the days of, well, even before we had repeaters and hubs, but the bus topology, and had repeaters and hubs and collisions and all these kinds of things. And the Ethernet frame needed to be a minimum size so that a device that sent an Ethernet frame on the bus would know whether or not a collision happened by the time it sent out the very last bit going out of the Ethernet frame. Again, we used to talk a lot more about this, but it's really with no longer having hubs and collision domains, or at least you shouldn't. It's really not necessary to go into any kind of real detail. The maximum frame size of traditional Ethernet 2 and 802.3 is 1518 bytes. So that takes into account the destination and source MAC addresses, the type field, the maximum amount of data, which is 1500 bytes, and the frame check sequence. There are jumbo frames and other things that we can have nowadays if the NICs and switches support them. We'll talk about this data and the 1500 bytes later as we go up the TCP stack. But remember in IP that this data is going to include things like an IP header, perhaps a TCP or UDP header, perhaps an application header, and definitely data. So all of this has to fit into the 1500 bytes, including the data itself. And we'll talk more about how this all happens in later videos. All right. Well, I hope this helps you understand a little bit more about the Ethernet frame.